Honour, it's a privilege to be here today. I know all of you are out for one of the better cliche on the very front line of the fight against austerity and the attempt by this government to make people who have absolutely nothing to do with this crisis to pay for it. Now, I don't know what to talk about because it's been such a slow news week. But I think maybe a good place to start would be a curse you mentioned. I don't know if people noticed, but Margaret Thatcher passed away this week. Now, I think it's interesting the debate that's been taking place this week because there was an attempt to interfere to turn that death into something, a kind of mixture of Princess Diana's funeral and a one-month-long Conservative political broadcast. And the most important thing, I think, for all of us is to have voices at the forefront who experienced the struggles of the 1980s. But one of the things I wanted to quickly talk about is the fact that many of the things we're fighting about today, many of the issues, many of the social problems that we confront, of course, owe their roots to the devastation that took place in the 1980s, the fact there are 5 million people languishing on social housing waiting lists, the fact we are spending billions of pounds subsidising landlords with housing benefit, the fact that the number of families forced into the private rented sector with a sky-high unregulated rents has doubled in the last 5 years, and of course, as we know, the consequences that has for communities as the far-right exploit housing shortages to scapegoat immigrants or anyone deemed less deserving. But we know, of course, the reality that the real responsibility lies with the selling off of council housing and the failure to replace the stock that had been sold off from the 1980s onwards. We're talking about this poison, they call it a debate. I think it gives it too much gravitas, this poison debate over benefits that is currently waging in this country. Being waged in this country. Now, of course, this idea of huge numbers of people who are taking the mick, playing the system, and so on. But the reality is that millions of industrial secure jobs were emptied out of communities across the country in the 1980s, and they were never replaced by successive governments. And when we're talking about the financial crisis, which ordinary people are currently being made to pay for, well, of course, the roots of that crisis are again in the 1980s, the gutting of our manufacturing sector in favour of an unregulated financial services sector, the city run rampant, which explains the situation we're in today, and of course the explosion of inequality, the fact that we're in the centre of a city which is one of the most unequal in the Western world. The top 10% are worth 273 times the bottom 10%, of course, that inequality exploded in the 1980s. We've got to also look at some of the other divisions that opened up or were exploited in the 80s. Now, we know Margaret Thatcher's governments, of course, denounced those fighting for freedom and liberation in South Africa as terrorists, but also the crude attempts often by politicians to turn people against each other. Well, a striking example was in 1979, when Margaret Thatcher herself said, people are really rather afraid that the country might be rather swamped with people with a different culture. An outright attempt to exploit those tensions, and of course we've seen several disastrous attempts since then. Now, in terms of austerity, which is currently being waged, you know better than I that although austerity is funneling people right across the country, including the poorest in society, that some people are hit even harder than others. And of course, it goes without saying, tragically, that BME people are amongst those being hit hardest as this crisis, this financial crisis, has been hijacked by the Conservative Party. We know even before the crisis that BME people were far more likely to live in poverty, that more than 3/4 of Pakistani or Bangladeshi children at the age of 7 lived in poverty. And over half of black children the same age also lived in poverty. Now that's going to get a lot worse. It's estimated over this Parliament 1 million kids will be driven into poverty by this government, and disproportionately those affected will be PME kids.
It's the same with homelessness. It's also, of course, unemployment. Absolute scandal in this country that the number of young black men out of work is now over half. It has doubled since Lehman Brothers came crashing down. Now, we've been told ever since this crisis began that we're all in this together. It's a statement that's veered from the ludicrous to the offensive ever since it was first uttered. Because it remains boom time for the people at the top. People have seen the Sunday Times rich list looking at the top 1,000 wealthiest people in this country. Well, in 2010, their wealth went up by 30%. It was the biggest jump ever recorded in the history of that rich list. It surged again by nearly a fifth the year after, and last year it increased yet again. But the reality for everybody else is rather different. Indeed, the average working Briton is now facing the biggest squeeze in their living standards since my gran was born in the early 1920s. Save the Children recently revealed the world that many journalists and politicians have no interest in, of parents choosing between heating their homes and feeding their children, of skipping hot meals to make sure their sons and daughters are fed. The only industry booming in this country are food banks, which catered for 100,000 people last year alone. And of course, in schools, it was reported last year the size of school lunch portions is shrinking because of budget cuts and breakfast clubs are being cut. This is the 7th richest country on earth, and apparently we can no longer afford to feed our poorest children. That is the reality of austerity in this country. But what's been so alarming, distressing about this government, scandalous even, is the attempt to redirect people's entirely justifiable anger at the fact they're getting poorer year on year, from those at the top who cause this crisis to people's neighbours down the streets, the working poor against the unemployed, non-disabled people against disabled people, private sector workers against public sector workers, those already living here against immigrants. And what they say is this each time. They say to low-paid workers, your pay packet is being cut because of your bosses, or your tax credits have been cut by the government. Who should you hate? The stranger down the road. If in the private sector you don't have a pension because pensions have been decimated in the private sector, who should you hate? The nurse down the road who still has an intact pension. If you're struggling to make ends meet, as so many are increasingly in this country, who should you turn your hatred on? The immigrant who has access to supposedly luxurious benefits which don't even exist. And it's the same argument time and time again. You've been mugged, and therefore your less deserving neighbour should be mugged as well. It's the politics of divide and rule. And that's where we come in as a movement. Because I find going around the country that there's a lot of anger out there. There's a lot of fear. There's one thing missing, and that's hope. And without hope, people don't fight back. People get angry and they scream at their television set, but they won't come out and have the confidence to resist what is happening to them. It was Harvey Milk, the US civil rights the alarm bell of austerity. Harvey Milk, he said in the 1970s, I know you cannot live on hope alone, but without it life is not worth living. And it's true, without giving people hope, people won't have the confidence to fight back. So I just want to quickly talk about how the idea of an alternative, because with no alternative, there won't be that resistance. We should be saying this: it is an absolute outrage millions of pounds of taxpayers' money is being wasted on housing benefit. That's not lining the pockets of the tenants. It's lining the pockets of wealthy landlords charging extortionate rents because successive governments didn't build council housing and we didn't control rents. So we should be saying, build council housing, lift the borrowing requirements on councils, it'll pay for itself through rent, that'll create jobs, stimulate the economy and bring down the 5 million strong social housing waiting list as well as housing benefit. Again, tax credits, a lifeline for millions of people in this country, particularly PME workers who are far more likely to be in low-paid jobs. But let's be clear about what tax credits are. They're a subsidy for low pay because bosses aren't paying their workers properly. If we had a living wage, we'd bring down the billions being spent on tax credits and other benefits too, because 93% of new housing benefit claimants are actually in work. And let's stop subsidising unemployment. Let's create hundreds of thousands of renewable energy jobs as they've done in Germany, taking on the environmental crisis and taking on the jobs crisis as well. Now, in terms of the banks, the problem with the banks is we nationalise the debt and privatise the profit. We bail them out, but we don't have any control over what they do. So we should be arguing that we, the taxpayer, should have control of those banks to create a public investment bank to help rebuild the economy in the way we want to rebuild it. And of course, tax justice. We hear about benefit fraud every single day, and it does exist. It's worth less than 1% of welfare spending. Compare that to tax evasion, tax avoidance by the people at the top. 1.2 billion lost through benefit fraud, 25 billion pounds lost through tax avoidance by the people at the top. The likes of Sir Philip Green, who runs Topman and Topshop, who at this moment has registered his company under his wife's name in Monaco, so he doesn't have to pay any taxes. He's been made an advisor by this government on how to cut our public services. These are the things we need to be talking about, instead of making ordinary people pay to actually use this crisis to transform our country, to rebuild our communities. But we also need to give a voice to those affected. We need to combat the demonisation that takes place by giving that platform. The fact that Costa Coffee opened up a shop in Nottingham with 8 near minimum wage jobs and 1,701 people applied. In fact, DFS opened up a shop in Bristol with 9 jobs, 1,200 people applied. That is the desperation out there that isn't being covered in favour of scroungers with 50 kids in mansions made out of widescreen television sets. We have to show the reality of what's going out there. Now, one of the things, just before I wrap up, that I'm involved with is the People's Assembly, which has been set up by trade unions like Unite, like Unison, like PCS, like RMT. The idea of that is to build a mass anti-austerity movement, linking with key campaigns, with the Green Party, with Labour Party activists, but crucially, people in no home whatsoever. We're holding a mass rally on June the 22nd in Westminster Central Hall, and rallies across the country. And I think we have a responsibility to build that movement. It isn't acceptable that 5 years on from this crisis, we still haven't built that broad anti-austerity movement to shatter the consensus, the cartel of British politics. I urge you all to support that. At the end of the day, the way we get change, the way we get progress, and it's the same whether the anti-racism movement, the LGBT movement, the women's liberation movement, isn't through the goodwill and generosity of those above, through the struggle and sacrifice of people from below. That is how we change things. And all I would say to end up is, firstly, I hope this conference is obviously a resounding success and you leave with determination to take on austerity, take on this government and give a voice to others. And above all this, we stand together, we fight together, and friends, we will win this together.